So a little while ago I made an ill-fated video about how I love the themes of Lovecraft's stories, but I just hate his prose. I find his writing very dull and monotonous and very anticlimactic. That drew in so many 50-year-old men that my comments were flooded with people calling me a silly little girl and a pronoun pansy, and then confrontationally asking me what I've contributed to the world. Too many achievements to possibly list here, I'm afraid, Reginald, but I digress. Yet, despite all the Lovecraft discourse, all the literature snobbery, there was one offhand comment I made in that video so flippantly, so thoughtlessly, just dropped in there like a kid into a zoo exhibit, that I never ever thought it would bite me in the ass. I said, Bloodborne plays like shit. I almost ended up having to disable comments in that video, it got so bad. I don't get the vitriol, honestly. Man, you know, Monster Hunter World has armies of dedicated fans. People who have played nothing but Monster Hunter World for hundreds or thousands of hours. And I could go, man, this game plays like shit, and they would go, yeah, it kinda does. Because it kinda does, right? But you love it anyway. But I mention offhand a negative opinion of Bloodborne in a video about something else, and I get some of the most intense and miserable backlash of my YouTube career. But between all the teenage boy meltdowns, I did have a few people genuinely inquire as to my thoughts on Bloodborne, why I felt that way, and what they might be able to do to change my mind. The answer is 10 grand and a really nice outfit for my cat to wear. Serious inquiries only, please. And I thought, you know what, maybe I should make a video about this. Anyway, without further ado, as voted for by my patrons, here it is. Why I went cold on Bloodborne, Nioh, the game that raised my standards. Now, when I first heard of Nioh, I took a pretty elitist stance towards it. I saw loads of people sneering at it, writing it off as just Japanese Dark Souls, a pale imitation of a much cooler game. Just Dark Souls, but with all the geography and all the enemies replaced with remnants of Japanese history. I sat among my echelons of Dark Souls anoraks and felt completely justified in my disdain towards a game I had never played, nor even bothered to see gameplay footage of. And I was a bitch, you know? I'm sorry, Nioh. When I came to try the games, I found that this assumption was, to put it bluntly, short-sighted, ill-conceived, flimsy. I bought Nioh 2 first, since it was on the cusp of being released, and I thought it might be a nice step for my budding Twitch channel to take. I enjoyed it so much that one of my viewers, a man who fallaciously went by the name Worst Player Ever, donated the first game of the series to me. So yeah, as I played, I started to acknowledge that there are some things the Souls series does miles better than Nioh, but to call Nioh a Souls clone was, as I learned, complete dumbassery. Beyond adopting a template similar to the general rhythm of a Souls-like, namely route punctuated by checkpoints, resting at which causes all enemies to respawn, death triggers the loss of collected tangible experience that can be used to purchase goods and services, and needs to be picked up off the floor, bosses with big throbbing health bars, Nioh turned out to not be a clone at all. Structurally, yes, but also no. Nioh was something I came to love so much more. I started to realise that people who accused Nioh of being a shady rip-off of their beloved Souls games had likely actually never played it, just like I hadn't all that time ago. I still see them lurking in the comment sections of various videos on or about Nioh, the kind of people who go onto YouTube every day and search Nioh review, and then click the only result that they haven't already seen, only to pause the video 1 second in, scroll down into the comments and type pathetic Souls clone, just Ninja Dark Souls, and then go back to harassing e-girls on Twitter with one hand and jacking off with the other. Tragically, every fandom seems to have a minority like that. Anyway, if you were to sit down and really get into this game, you know, give it a proper running jump at earning any benefit of the doubt, you would realise very quickly that the Nioh games are in a complete league of their own. Both the Souls series and the Nioh series have their own merits and detractions, but they are by no means the same. The Souls series, I think, is particularly exceptional in all manners design. Level design, story design, both implicit and overt, boss and enemy designs, but I don't think many games can truly be a 10 out of 10. And to try and balance all of this design with perfect combat would be like a fool's errand. The Souls games aren't bad by any metric, I mean, they're brilliant, but I felt like mechanically they paled in comparison to Nioh, a game whose mechanical refinement was leaps and bounds ahead of whatever I imagined possible. I mean, Nioh is no 10 out of 10 either, believe me. The game's visuals especially are reused to the point of exhaustion, especially between the first and second installments, which saw many enemies and levels just entirely copy-pasted. Most of the minor enemies you encounter in the Nioh series are just rehashes of man with troubled hairline, and maps tend to be along the line of cave or destroyed village, with a few notable exceptions. You will see the same bosses used over and over in Nioh 1, and then you will see them again in Nioh 2. You know, I don't expect any game to have it all. You know, we go to different games to scratch different itches. And for those of you who love combat, Nioh is going to scratch you raw. Now, here's an unusual note. I started with Nioh 2, and for any newcomer to the series, I would also recommend you start with Nioh 2. Some people insist that newcomers play Nioh 1 first, but they are always people who played Nioh 1 first, and they cannot be trusted under any conditions. Do not listen to them. Do not make eye contact. They are unsalvageable people. We do Nioh 2 first, no exceptions, do not pass go, do not collect 200. As I'll get into, Nioh 2 is basically Nioh 1, but better developed, as a sequel should be. If you play the second first and then return to Nioh 1, you'll find yourself playing Nioh 2 but without the training wheels, and I do mean that better than it sounds. Also, Nioh 2 chronologically comes first as well, so if you prefer a bit of temporal consistency, you'll love it. Both games are hard, but Nioh 2 has a wider variety of approaches to take, so if something isn't working, you just try something else. Many of your skills as a player will improve simultaneously, like education but with spinning plates. Nioh 1 is much more refined. It's about mastering a few skills and learning the game inside out, and the difficulty ramps up silly hard. So if you start Nioh 1 with the kind of leg up you'll get, skill-wise obviously, from playing Nioh 2, you'll easily cut through a significant portion of that skill ceiling and reach the skill carpet on the upper skill floor, bursting out to the horror of the skill family that's living above you who never stop arguing. I mean, you'll still probably have a vile time with some of the early bosses, but this difficulty will come down more to learning each individual boss and just mastering their individual approach. More so than figuring out which end of the weapon you're using is the murderous one. And it does really help. Now, before we begin, please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the video. Share your own thoughts on the Nioh series and Ninja Gaiden if you've played that one, and we've got the new one coming out soon, the one based in China or something. How do you think the Nioh series and the Souls series compare? They're apple and oranges in many ways, but I'd still love to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you to my patrons for voting for this video, particularly Julia, Sam Jones, Carissa Fulcher, Brody Cullen, and Duck for being my highest tier patrons, and make sure to check out the links in the description if you're interested in becoming a patron and seeing my 5-minute review series, plus any other behind the scenes work and early access to videos. Still don't want to send me that 10k? Last chance? Okay, well, let's get going. Although I was introduced to Nioh through an appreciation of Souls games, and by extension combat-heavy games with a checkpoint experience boss system, the differences between these two Olympian franchises manifest right from the get-go. Firstly, while the Souls games will contain one uninterrupted linear game with a few branching pathways, each one an unforgettable adventure full of twists and turns and hidden details and unique items to find, Nioh's structure is level-based. You see an overworld map with levels on, you click the level, you do the level. Some people hate this, but because of Nioh's mechanical focus, a more sprawling map, even a linear one, would have done its fundamental gameplay mechanics a disservice. Nioh doesn't need the environment to tell a story because a lot of the story is told in cutscenes and dialogue. You're in historical fantasy demon Japan, which is all the environmental context you really need, and the focus of design is on creating extremely focused, refined, but fairly short experiences. The levels of this game can run you anywhere between 5 minutes and an hour, and golly gee whiz, do those hour-long ones exhaust you? If a 10-minute boss gauntlet is a sprint, these are cross-country marathons. They drag on for a long time. Sure, you can replenish items, magic, and ninja tools at every shrine, but first time through there will be moments where you run completely dry, at least on healing items, which will cripple your attempts to push onwards past the respawned enemies, because obviously they respawn when you die or rest at checkpoints. The sprints between shrines can be long indeed, and although you can open shortcuts and refine your route through the level, that is much easier said than done. Playing Nioh 2 for the first time, some of the boss fights alone would take me hours each. I had a really tough time with it, but I was properly addicted. You have your story missions, linear pathway, then boss with a cutscene before and after the level, and a cutscene for the boss itself, but you also have boss gauntlets, double boss fights that are supremely hard, and usually leveled so that they're better to come back to after finishing the next New Game Plus cycle. You have levels where you need to find items or chests, or help local yokai, that's demons, and levels where you pair up with allies who are typically notable figures from actual history. Now, I'm not suggesting that either the Souls series or the Nioh series have a better format than one another. I think each game has a format that works perfectly for what they want to convey and emphasize. Souls games do have a heavy combat focus. I mean, it's kind of what they're known for, but I feel mostly the games lend themselves to these sweeping stories, chance encounters, and exploration. For Souls games to have Nioh's granular map level navigation would neuter what makes the game so alluring in the first place, whereas Nioh's stories
aren't interesting to me, besides seeing all the cool spirits and demons and all that kind of thing. But I can't imagine anybody whatsoever picking up these games for the narrative alone. Yeah, you know, there is probably one goober out there who found their life enriched for the better after stepping into the world of Nioh, but I mean, there are also people in the world who enjoy sounding. Like, I can't account for every one of you.
Rather, this game's intrigue is almost entirely predicated on its mechanics, and so having tighter, more coordinated, polished, and specific missions suits the way Nioh is played. There will occasionally be branching paths or choices or secrets or special items, but you're never going to run into the Dark Lurker or find a secret hidden ending. And in gracious comparison to the deluge of difficulty to come, your first playthrough on a new game isn't too bad. You can enjoy New Game thoroughly without needing to make any kind of build, although it helps, as I'm sure you can imagine, but rather New Game is like the starter to the main course. You enjoy the game at your own pace, building a foundation of knowledge and levels and skills, familiarizing yourself with the stance systems and parries and magic and ninjutsu. It's like lining your stomach before you go to the pub. You know, the bagel you haphazardly guzzle while your friends are waiting for you is just as integral to your night as the tequila slammers you order when you arrive at the bar. You learn the bosses and discover which weapons you like the best, and by the time you arrive in New Game Plus, you are carved up and ready for Nioh, whether you know it or not.
I guess the sad reality is that most players will end their playtime here. I mean, it's understandable, especially if they were only kind of averagely enjoying the game in the first place and just finished it to see the story out, but you know, it is a shame. The real meat of this game is when the gloves come off. If your gloves are full of meat? Anyway, a lot of people consider Nioh 1 to be an unfair game, full of cruel choices and spiteful mechanics and nasty tricks. And they're right.
Nioh 1 is an unfair game, an extremely unfair game, especially as you wind up through New Game Plus, Plus 2, Plus 3 and Plus 4, at which point all enemies will one-shot you regardless of HP. Even minor enemies can apply debuffs to you to slow you or weaken you or apply status effects, and my oh my, do Team Ninja absolutely love putting you in an empty room with two of the hardest bosses in the game, slapping you on the arse and shouting, "Hey, look over there," while they duck outside and lock the door behind them. But the thing about Nioh is that you can be completely unfair back. See, back when Nioh first released, it accrued the standard flock of interested parties. The player base formed, but as time passed, the wider crowd eventually filtered out to new games and new pastures. Like the tide pulling away from the shore to reveal big clogs of seaweed and old suitcases with dead bodies in them, the core player base remained. And of that core player base, there was a loud, hardcore minority that had completely mastered the game, as loud, hardcore minorities tend to do, since Nioh makes excellent offerings of buffs and kit combinations and whatnot to allow you to put together some insane builds. People were getting really filthy with it. We were seeing filthy, sexy builds. I had a sword that hit for 21,000 damage, and that's not even high end, and it was awesome. But when you have an intense minority of your player base that rinse the available content clean and master everything there is to master, and then start shouting at you that the game is too easy, you do what any sane developer would do. You nerf their kit, and then you release onto this mortal plane the hardest, nastiest, and most downright spiteful DLC you can make. It was horrible. See, not only were the DLCs themselves rock solid, even in New Game, the DLCs were scaled for the end of New Game Plus, including nasty new enemies that do nasty amounts of damage. These DLCs also added New Game Plus cycles. Both games were released with New Game and New Game Plus, but each DLC installment added New Game Plus 2, New Game Plus 3, and New Game Plus 4, or Way of the Demon, Way of the Wise, and Way of the Nioh, respectively. Plus, both games had an optional underworld, 999 floors of incrementally harder bosses.
But unlike when Sony first-party games release a New Game Plus mode a few months after the initial release of whichever game they're shunting out onto stores, with an accompanying finish the game on New Game Plus trophy to get players to pick the game up again for whatever reason, without having to produce any meaningful DLC, God forbid, Nioh's New Game Plus is far more measured and balanced. In fact, I think it's kind of the soul of the game itself.
You'll have the same enemies, but with new variants. Some enemies will have entirely new moves. Enemies you could basically just sit behind and whack away at while they struggle to turn around will now be able to ass stomp you with a bewildering one-shot kill that will take any player unaware the first time around.
It will become entirely pointless to fight certain enemies the way you've always been fighting them. And you'll have to figure out different plays and approaches, have to use magic and debuffs more, and rather than just face-tanking damage, you have to learn the moveset of every single individual enemy as though it is a mini-boss, focusing on weak points and using element-specific magic and weapons. Every jump into the next New Game Plus cycle will see you floundering, until you've managed to make the simultaneous jump gear-wise. And this will be the most important preparation you can make at any point in the game. In Nioh, there's nothing more important than your gear level, at least until you start looking at builds.
Thankfully, Nioh introduced divine and later ethereal weapons, which are green and orange respectively, and come with their own plus value, +1, +2, +3, etc., which in the simplest possible terms denotes damage output. A +3 weapon is made by matching 2 +2 weapons of any type, so a +25 weapon is made by combining 2 +24 weapons. Making these upgrades does sound like an arduous process, and it will be if you're slow to move through the game, but if you're hopping forward through each New Game Plus mission, challenging yourself and being brave rather than sitting back, it will fly right by. From New Game Plus 2, you can run into red enemies. These have special buffs to their own performance and can also cast debuffs on you just by hitting you. If you get hit with Sloth, for example, which as the name suggests slows your speed drastically, you are basically dead, and a lot of enemies cast it. But then you unlock it, and you cast it, and it becomes your trump card. See, Nioh is completely unfair in a way that I love. Enemies will one-shot you from their perfect placement right from a corner you would never expect. They drop on you from nowhere, they outnumber you, they use back-to-back nasty attacks to bully you with, they have access to crazy abilities, magic weapons, and horrible debuff talismans. They can do 20,000 damage in one hit. But so can you with a bit of work, so buy my course and learn from the master. The thing I really respected about Nioh was that it gave me absolutely everything I needed to know when I needed to know it. The displays are often awash with little numbers and words and help text, there are tutorials for everything, and there's even a dojo you can use to practice with all the different kinds of weapons. Every unlockable skill has an on-screen display of exactly how to perform it, with a short video of how it will look when it's performed correctly. No weapons have hidden attributes. Every weapon will have up to several slots for potential buffs and skills. For example, an extra 30% damage when using a particular move. Every aspect of this can be explicitly explained to you if you want it to be. You have everything you need to make the best combinations of skills to have the highest possible damage output. There's an in-game compass that shows you the direction of your mission objective, albeit not specifically how to get there, and having certain accessories equipped might show you locations of enemies, items, and special little green friends called Kadamas. This game very happily gives you the keys to your own success, because it knows that even with all the help you can get, you will still not beat it without a lot of time, effort, and mastery. Nioh 2, the one I did first, the one I cut my teeth on and had to learn the basics with, took a whopping 250 hours for me to get every trophy in the game. Nioh 1 took 150, and I do really love this, because I do appreciate some honesty in my games. I'm looking at you, FromSoft.
Something I struggled with fundamentally in the Souls series, especially in the later games, was the way it tended to conceal information and weapons and resolutions to you for the sake of kind of adding artificial difficulty. See, when Nioh throws cheap combat at you, you can respond by throwing cheap combat back. But when games use cheap tricks to conceal secrets from you, how can you be cheap in return beyond, like, Googling it?
I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes these more subtle experiences FromSoft provide can be really cool, especially when they shine a different light on the game or offer slightly different advantages. Think of the flames you could light in the Lost Sinners boss fight, finding the Hypergean jail? I don't know how you say that. Early game via getting killed by a specific enemy that terrified me too much to go near, or speaking to Hawkeye Goth before fighting Calamite. Those were very rewarding finds and things I really enjoyed putting together. They're not easily missable if you're exploring and doing your due diligence, but still far enough off the beaten path that they are a rewarding find. But as the fanbase got more intense, I guess FromSoft needed to start accounting for the spread of information online. I mean, they did very much encourage it in a lot of ways, but we also started to tip from "we've filled this game with amazing secrets you can find and share with the community" into the region of "fundamental narrative beats are now obscure for the sake of being a part of community discovery." So we started to get endings like Sekiro's Purification ending, which I remind you is needed to unlock the boss gauntlets that were later patched in, so each ending walls off a significant chunk of the game. These endings required a Herculean amount of effort, reloading areas over and over again, using the game's otherwise fairly token eavesdropping mechanic, for example, or just a quick Google search. And let's be honest, we all searched for the answers on Google. The amount of people who actually played as intended and got every single ending completely organically are for sure sub 5%, if not less. I'd say 2%. If you're in the comments right now like, "Hey, wait a minute, I did all of this off my own back, what do you mean?" Then congratulations. Without a shred shred of sarcasm, you are in a very small minority of people who did that as intended. Often you'll see people say things like, Dark Souls relies on the sharing of knowledge, you are supposed to Google it, and it will be sandwiched between two comments that both instead suggest something along the line of, you're supposed to figure it out yourself, you're not supposed to Google it, it's very easy, I did it. Even though they definitely didn't, and are just posturing for the sake of not looking like a fake fan. So there is significant disagreement between people about the quality of these features.
Now, I definitely do not agree with the assertion that Google is an intended part of the experience of a game. But I have had, and it's in my Elden Ring UX video, so the comments are disabled, but in that I had reams of people explaining to me that the designers absolutely intended you to Google things to get the full experience of every Souls game. Like, the full experience of the gameplay. But on my life, no designer is going to have player Googles it as a step in like a user flow. Users having to go off app to find something fundamental to gameplay is bad design. It doesn't matter what facade it sits under.
Now, I'm not conflating this kind of bad design with community discovery, which is the term used to describe the act of working as a community to find secrets and hidden items and locations. This is part of the intended experience, word of mouth. Like, this is legit. I'm not talking about that. There are some aspects of Souls games, like discovering Ash Lake by hitting a wall in the Great Hollow, that are definitely put there by designers to be rumours that get spread around in the fandom. They are aspects of the game that aren't necessary, but figuring them out and taking advantage of them will make the game more fun to play. It makes your experience with the game feel more special and unique. You can still really enjoy the game without them, it's just nice to discover and use them. That is the best thing for a rumoured item to be, I think. Rumours. Nice to haves. But as the Souls series went on, it just got to the point where the expectation of the player to explore, and the awareness that a player was going to Google the shit out of it, began to get crossed in the design choices. Everything became very superficially obscure, details obfuscated under a few arbitrary layers for the sake of being unearthed in a 10-minute and 3-second YouTube video, and often core aspects of gameplay got lost in that need to bury bones for community researchers to find. If you found it yourself, sure, but you didn't, did you?
And that's what I like about Nioh. It's not like that, because it doesn't need to be artificially obscure when it comes to gameplay mechanics. Sure, some people like the explorative aspects of the Souls series, and I completely understand, but what I ultimately respect about Nioh is the fact that it feels comfortable being entirely honest with you about what's happening at any given moment. There are no hidden weapons in Nioh, no hidden bosses, no hidden endings. I do enjoy those things from time to time, and if I want them, I'll load up a Souls game and play that, or something like that. Don't get me wrong, I do really love Soulsborne games, I'm not hating on them today. But Nioh has a dedication to being honest that I admire so much, and I completely respect. Every single thing in this game is available to you if you have the skill to fight your way to it. And the game is very, very confident that you won't be able to.
At the most basic level of Nioh 1, you have 5 options for weapons: swords, dual swords, hatchets, kusarigama, axes, with odachi and tonfas added in DLC updates. Now, I'm a basic bitch, so my run-through of Nioh saw me use a sword, and my run-through of Nioh 2 saw me use an odachi, which is basically just a really big sword, but I tried every single weapon thoroughly and found things that worked about all of them. I ended up loving the switchglaive the most, a weapon added in Nioh 2, but I didn't really get along with hatchets, which never felt like they did much. Tonfas were all about depleting stamina, or ki as it's called in the game, and going for finishing moves once the opponent is staggered, but this process just felt long and roundabout. Like, you'd batter somebody for 5 minutes and then do a finishing move, but if you hadn't specced into tonfas, you would be doing so little damage that it felt like death by 1,000 tickles. Tonfas are definitely a lifestyle, not just a phase. I adored the axe, the moveset of which is crammed full of heavy attacks that stagger enemies non-stop, and I felt like the kusarigama was a weapon that deserved respect, always used by the big brains and the strategists and the intellectuals, but I never quite managed to harness it, which says more about me than I am willing to acknowledge. Every weapon in this game has 3 stances: low, mid, and high stance. In low stance, you do less damage, but you have more maneuverability, actions take less stamina, dodges are longer and with better iframes. In high stance, you hemorrhage stamina with the most basic actions, but your blocking is better and you do far more damage with every attack. In mid stance, you have the best of both worlds. Certain stances only have access to certain skills, or you can lock different skills to different different stances so that you can have several skills available to you at once, as long as you're flicking between all your stances. An ability called Key Flux, which allowed me to do this very aggressive fart that knocked immediate enemies back and depleted their stamina whenever I was blocking, served me super well in a high stance where my blocking was most effective and was invaluable to my first playthrough, especially when I was up against human enemies. This was bound to block and triangle in high stance, but in mid stance, this same button combination would trigger a far more offensive move called Flowing Shadow. I don't know what it would trigger in low stance because I don't use low stance because I'm not a massive bitch. Although you can unlock countless skills for your weapons, each one a legit individual move with honest pros and cons to its usage, you'll not be able to have them all active at once, so you need to assess what actually works for you and which skills benefit from your gear the most. Certain skills can be imbued with poison and other status effects with the right unlocks, which can definitely swing a fight in your favour, even if it seems minimal at first. As you go, you'll unlock skills that cause your stance to change automatically, mid to high or low and vice versa, and you'll start to be able to string abilities together until you're flying through missions. You'll unlock skills that give you better stamina regeneration if you change stance when you key pulse, which is an ability that allows you to basically just suck a bit of stamina back, like Bloodborne's rally system but for asthma. Stamina in Nioh is really important. You can run out of it very fast, and when you're depleted, getting knocked will stun your character for something like 5 full seconds. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but that's absolutely enough to get your head caved in with the downward swing of an axe the size of your mattress. Human enemies can also do finishing moves on you, the same that you can do to them when their stamina is depleted. Circle of life. One thing you will notice is that blocking tends to be far more useful than dodging. Unlike Souls games where you dodge and you have a whole host of iframes that allow you to stand right under an enemy's flung hammer and not even blink, Nioh's dodging offers far less iframes and is instead more there to be used for the sake of positioning, which a lot of enemies will punish if you do badly. You can dodge stuff, but ironically it's quite hit or miss. Some enemies have extremely deadly long and short range attacks that punish bad distance. The Karasu Tengu, the bane of many a playthrough, has a spinning attack that punishes you for being too close and a lunging attack that punishes you for being too far. So you need to move forwards and back like you're waltzing with it. The fights end up being very romantic. Some enemies have very dangerous attacks that guard their backs, so you can't just squat behind them and smash away. The One-Eyed Oni gets new abilities in New Game Plus and beyond, most notably an ass slam with no wind-up whatsoever. He'll just fall back on you. Like my biggest fear of driving behind those lorries that carry lots of cars and one might just fall out and I'll drive onto it.
Anyway. It's like that, just as deadly.
Some enemies, like the basic red yokai, will grab you with very little warning, so you have to be prepared to dart back out of reach at the first sign. You also have access to a parry system, but these need to be unlocked and parries will work differently for every weapon, against every weapon. It's very confusing. I occasionally try to parry an enemy I'm confident with, but in my honest opinion it's not really worth the massive margin of error. Often I will just block or move out of the way. Still, when you do manage to get a parry off, it feels amazing. Some moves just can't be parried, and the only way to learn this is when you get your skull caved in. Other moves are deceptively easy to parry. Some parries allow you to counter-attack, but some just move you elsewhere. The parry ability on my Switchglaive would just plant me behind an enemy in a single movement, so I could immediately attack their back if I so wished, or run away, which, depending on the situation, I would quite happily do. Beyond this, we have Ninjutsu and Onryo Magic, two skills with reassuringly low barriers to entry. You just need to have at least 30 in each applicable stat to have access to the dojo mission needed to learn how to use them. Completing these dojo missions unlocks the rest of each tree, and then you're off. They scale off those stats alone, meaning you don't need to split your XP across 2 or 3 stats at once. Ninjutsu comprises bombs and shuriken and kunai, which, unless you're using a ninjutsu build, won't necessarily do you an insane amount of benefit, but the ninjutsu tree also contains the quick change scroll. This scroll allows you to return with half your HP after taking a killing blow. Your character will just pop out of the sky in a puff of smoke and need to drop to the ground again, which allows you to get a perfect plunging attack should you need to, but also gives enemies the opportunity to shoot you out of the sky, which can be as disastrous as it sounds. Still, it comes in useful. On the flip side, Onryo Magic is far more useful. You mainly have access to shots and talismans. You can fire explosive fireballs, surges of water that come out of the ground, or zap enemies with lightning magic. These are fairly deadly moves and don't require the use of mana or anything like that. They just have limited uses each and need to be recharged at shrines. You also have defense talismans, so you can increase your defense to fire, lightning, water, etc. And you have buff and debuff talismans. You can buff yourself so you soak up more Amrita as you fight, which allows you to use special moves, you can increase your attack at the expense of your defense, you can sloth enemies or weaken them so they do less damage, you can lower their defense too. There's a lot on the table, and as you move into later New Game Plus cycles, you'll find yourself standing outside boss doors just smacking on 8 talismans in a row in preparation for the fight to come. Each one has a timer that it will be active for, and there's nothing worse than taking a killing blow just as your quick change scroll expires. Although in New Game, the game does encourage you to shop around and explore and find out what you enjoy, especially with those dojo missions. You'll want to start properly specializing as you work through the game into those hardened New Game Plus cycles. What I like about Nioh is that you'll often create a build centered around a specific move. For example, take the sword ability EI Quick Draw. Let's say you want to make a quick draw build. You'll look for gear that has skills which complement the move, adding incremental damage percentages. Some gear has a specific gear set, and the more pieces of gear in that set you have equipped, the more effects you'll see. With this, you can be doing tens of thousands of damage with that one move. Your other moves will do big dirty boy damage too, but the one move you are framing your attributes and bonuses around will do awesome damage and will form the core of your approach to any fight. In Nioh 1, gear can be farmed randomly just by doing levels over and over again. You don't need to go into New Game Plus to get bosses to respawn, you can just redo their levels as many times as you want, which I like. If there's something you especially enjoy, you can just sit in it for hours and hours and have fun, and the random loot will filter in. Alternatively, in Nioh 1 at least, this was nerfed in Nioh 2, you can do Revenant farming. So imagine Bloodstained in Dark Souls, where you can see the flickering memory of a fellow player moments before their untimely death and then try to piece together how they died. I mean, they usually stabbed, but now imagine that when you interact with that bloodstain, it comes alive and beats the shit out of you. Those are Revenants, phantoms of a previous player that come alive, wearing their gear and using their weapons and moveset that will attack you on the spot. If you beat them, they'll drop some loot, and you can farm their loot to pick up attributes on weapons that have been carefully slotted together. Rather than farming random loot and relying on random chance, you can just farm Revenants and get pre-farmed loot, albeit at level 1, so you have to level it up. There's even a special mission it's specifically done in at the end of New Game Plus called Spirit Stone Huntress. So if you want loot, you can go to the loot party and enjoy all the offerings. These Revenants stay there for a long time as well. I was farming the same guys for gear over multiple weeks. All you have to do is die, either by dying to a Revenant or using the weird suicide sword you get, and your Revenant will be there for weeks or months with no extra effort from you. This means helping other players by giving them loot is not time consuming and doesn't require you to have to speak to anybody, because Nioh fans would rather do a level 1 run before they speak to anybody, especially girls. Ugh. Beyond that, you can farm for gear in the Underworld, a post-game area comprising of 999 floors of misery with double boss fights and boss fights with major nerfs and buffs, all giving the boss an advantage of course, and the best graces and attributes can be earned here, although you do need to fight all the way to New Game Plus 4 in order to unlock it, which might be a bit extreme depending on your purposes. Builds were, for me, must-haves in Nioh 1. I could not finish New Game Plus 2 in its entirety without them. In Nioh 2, they're extremely useful, but they're not so mandatory. Now, one thing that is mandatory, not just because it literally is mandatory, but also because it is too fantastic to ignore, is the magic weapon. In Nioh 1, you have a bar of something called Amanita? I can't remember. Vibranium, Tesseract, Unobtainium, Aluminum, you know it's all the same. Amrita is like the equivalent of souls. It's XP that can be spent on goods, but also used for leveling. I think Amanita is the one you collect to fill bars, but fuck if I remember through all the different words. Anyway, when your big old sack of Unobtainium fills to the top, you'll be able to activate a special combat mode, Living Weapon. Your weapon will take on the form of your guardian spirit, which is sick and adorable and I love it, except the horrible centipede or the disgusting octopus guy, both of which made me recoil in horror at the sight of them, like a conservative Granite Pride parade. It's exceptional. There are loads of guardian spirits to choose from. Dogs, dragons, nine-tailed foxes, birds. Then you start to get into the waifu territory where it's Gardevoir syndrome all over again, and they basically just give you an animalistic woman in a cute outfit, which is more funny than intended. I can't wait to unlock Body Pillow Chan. Living Weapon became a bit of a trump card towards the end of New Game Plus 2 when my weapons were plus 35 each, closer to plus 40 if I remember correctly, but enemies were still fucking my shit up. My build meant I put out savage damage, but I had the constitution of a frail, malnourished housefly, and all it took was an angry glance to kill me dead, quick change scrolls notwithstanding. As I reached the end of New Game Plus 2, I started to get really fucked up in the double boss fights. Despite fighting well into New Game Plus 4 to get my gear, I ended up leaning very hard on the extra entire health bar you get just from activating Living Weapon, and the crazy damage and staggers you could pull off just by spamming basic attacks with it. It really was invaluable. In some fights, my weapon would run out of time or power or whatever, and I would just run around in the arena casting Amrita stones until I was powered up enough to just reactivate it and go ham again. Yeah, it's a bit cheap, but I plugged my levels into it to scale the fuck out of it, and then I just prayed. The game was still hard as nails, and I died many times regardless. regardless. In Nioh 1, crutches that you can rely on in Nioh 2 are absent. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Nioh 2 seems to have far more quick saves that allow you to climb up through particularly hard gauntlets, whereas Nioh 1 feels like it forces you to just do them from scratch every time. Enemies are much harder in Nioh 1, maliciously so in fact. There's a smaller range of weapons, magic and ninjutsu to resort to when any particular boss or enemy is giving you a lot of trouble. You have less options to throw at them, so you have to refine one or two instead. Nioh 2 did see Revenant farming nerfed, meaning exact perfect builds were more time consuming to craft, but by the same merit, the influx of extra mechanics and quality of life changes meant that the game no longer felt like running into the garage door over and over again, watching the indent of your swollen face gradually fill out across the cracking paint. Instead, it's like the garage door is just running into you over and over again. You know, just as painful, but with less legwork from you, and the garage door is red. To alleviate some of that difficulty, there is one thing the game did exceptionally well. Co-op. Both games can be played in co-op through two avenues. You can do random encounters where you just queue into any available game and can help others. I used to join low-level lobbies to help them with bosses they were stuck with, only to watch them try and 1v1 the very mini-boss that had been flipping them inside out over and over again for the last 7 hours and die in a single hit. Then I'd get sent home. Alternatively, you can set up rooms for expeditions in specific missions. These are a little better. As a team, you will have one single bar. When you die, your grave will sit on the floor and you can either use a huge chunk of that bar to revive on the spot, or your teammate can run over and revive you themselves, although the bar will be ticking down the entire time. If the bar depletes during a boss fight, nothing happens until the very last player dies. Although their teammates can't be revived, they just have to watch. But if the bar depletes during the level, you'll have a choice to either abandon the expedition or continue with less rewards, and then you start at the last checkpoint again. Any shortcuts you've opened will still be open, so you can basically just pick up wherever you need to. This is the kind of experience I do wish the Souls games had a little more when it came to co-op. I don't mind the PvP experience. I think getting randomly jumped on by an enemy invader you're not even slightly prepared for is hilarious and frankly brilliant. The quintessential Dark Souls experience was me trying to run through Darkroot Garden on the PS3 version, getting invaded by people with twinked gear until I managed to dash through enough of the level to get to Sif. It's a hilarious story we all share, it's what brings us together. But when it comes to co-op in Dark Souls, especially co-oping with people off your friends list rather than random co-op encounters, it's kind of a pain in the arse. Resummoning friends over and over between every boss fight, having to do each area twice, especially in Elden Ring, just adds a layer of just needless fiddling about. Especially when we factor in bollocks like soul memory, you're just sitting in a party doing maths and getting really upset, so D&D fans will at least be familiar. My only issue with Nioh's co-op is that although enemy and boss health bars and damage scale in line with the number of people accompanying you on this expedition, their moveset doesn't. What I mean by this is that Nioh bosses will usually only have moves that damage one player at a time. Sure, some of them have moves that swing in big circles or do AoE damage, but largely you can have one person kite the aggro while the other person goes ham on them reasonably unpunished. This renders several of the boss fights easy, which as we all know brings great shame upon Nioh. We all know that quality equals difficulty, and doing things easier to any capacity, be that by making use of the game's tools, using good weapons, or for shame using co-op, is a cardinal sin and will not go on ignored. By the time we reach Nioh 2, we add so much more utility to the base moveset and mechanics. It's how a sequel should be. It takes the original and just develops it. It is a more developed Nioh 1, or like I said before, it is Nioh 1 on easy mode, and absolutely one to play first. Now, the best part of Nioh 2 is that your character is a yokai. While you play as just a dude in Nioh 1, and don't you dare recite to me the fact that he's based on a real person, I've been delivered that line thousands of times, in Nioh 2 you are a demon. It's sick. And you get access to their demon abilities. Nioh 1's living weapon becomes a yokai form, turning you into an awesome looking brute, feral or phantom yokai, each with entirely different movesets and utilities. You can go ham on enemies in this form roughly the same way you could with the living weapon, and each form has a special parry you can do even when you're not in the form specifically. See, Nioh 2 adds yokai parries. These are absolutely gorgeous. While all enemies have their usual movesets, Nioh 2 adds some moves to the enemy's moveset that bring them this red blur and distinctive noise. This is a parryable move, and hitting them with a well-timed parry will cancel the move, which can be very useful as they're usually fucking devastating if they hit, and they also stagger the enemy. You have 3 different methods of parry, in line with which of the 3 types your guardian spirit is. If you have the brute parry, you do this big wind up and then smack them hard with a chicken drumstick. This means that you can't respond to red blur moves that hit immediately, and you have a harder time timing parries against red blur moves that have their own wind ups and attacks. But it works against red blur moves that don't actually have a trigger. Like if they use the red blur move, but the move is a spell that summons fire, this brute parry will knock them out. Your phantom parry, however, can't do that. The phantom parry is an immediate function. You literally press press it and boom, instant parry. This, like I mentioned, doesn't work against spells, it's a defensive parry, so whatever is hitting you needs to be making physical aggressive contact with you, or it needs to just be like a tangible physical attack.
You'll know what I mean if you play it or if you see gameplay footage of it, but basically you see an attack coming, you time it well, and then you smack the phantom parry out for immediate success, right? Some moves are harder to time the parry against, but it is a really rewarding one to do. It feels very good.
Finally, we have the feral parry, one I always considered to be like mad sweaty, used by people who really know what they're doing, and this one is a dodge. Your feral counter involves you just dodging forwards through the attack and probably get it to work, I think?
I don't know, I've tried a few times with this one, and I did get the trophy for doing it 5 times successfully, but I don't remember using it whatsoever. So I can only imagine it was a period of my life so fraught with stress that I have repressed it entirely.
What's more is that your guardian spirit can have yokai attacks. Whenever you kill an enemy, they can drop a core. You can pick that up and affix it to your guardian spirit, and you can use the parryable attack your enemies can use, which is sick and very useful. At first you can have 2, bound to R2 and square and triangle respectively, while your parry sits on R2 and circle. After a while you can have another one bound to R2 and cross. Later in the story you can have 2 guardian spirits at once, raising your number of available yokai attacks to 6. Yokai attacks need to be charged with the same goop you use to charge your yokai weapon, and some take more charge than others. There are knockback moves, status moves, and my favourite, moves that just do fat damage because life is too short to play this game like a competitive Pokemon match. Fuck Klefki. Before I even looked at Nioh, I did 5 playthroughs of Bloodborne. I got the platinum by save scumming the 3 endings and then just bizarrely continued the game through to New Game Plus 5, which really defeated the point of carefully saving and reloading for every ending. I really loved the game.
I think that Bloodborne has the best visual design in the entire FromSoft series. The enemies look amazing, the bosses are, while occasionally repeated a little bit too much, I mean, ironic me saying that, grotesquely well designed and so very fun. My favourite boss was Vicar Amelia, and I loved watching all the American YouTubers call her Vicar so much that her voice actress had to actually take a stand and get involved. She was so annoyed. I read Redgrave's interpretation of the Bloodborne lore in a single day, hunched over my desk back at a job I just did not like. I then explained it to my friends in a pub, and God, thank you so much to them for sitting through that and letting me say what I needed to say. I named my cat Yosefka, specifically Yosefka the Imposter, because she hasn't been to medical school, so she is not a doctor. I mean, I have t-shirts and merch. I'm a huge fan of Bloodborne. I am still a huge fan of Bloodborne.
But returning to Bloodborne again after finishing Nioh, I was disappointed and honestly grieving to find that all of a sudden I couldn't stand it. I've never been an FPS person, that is frames per second, not first person shooter, and I have no idea how people say they can see frame rate. Sure, you know, you put footage from 2 games literally side by side and I'll be able to tell you which one plays more smoothly, but for sure I don't have an eye for it. God, and when I tell you, Bloodborne is the only game it bothered me in. My annoyance started slowly in ways I couldn't quite put a finger on, nor a name to. I just didn't have the language needed to articulate what was bugging me. The combat looks very fast, and it feels like it would be fast, but after enjoying Nioh's buttery 60 FPS and extremely refined fluidity, coming back to Bloodborne felt like trudging through deep mud. Turns out Bloodborne is capped at a mighty 30 FPS. That's capped, like the very max it goes, and those of you who have played the game will know there are points in the game where it stutters badly. It can't be blamed. According to Beyond the Grave, Miyazaki had to scale back significantly on the Gothic architecture he wanted to integrate into the maps because all those damn polygons were affecting frames so badly, and the version we got was visually very scaled back from the version he wanted. And I'm fairly glad. Visually, like I said, a brilliant game.
Visuals are a huge part of Souls games, and it would not be a Souls game with that visual emphasis. Although, unfortunately, it did end up coming at the cost of performance issues and severely limited FPS in a game with a specific focus on speed and fluidity. And so frame rate was sacrificed for visuals. Alternatively, Nioh's emphasis is on mechanics, and the team don't care loads about visuals. I mean, it still looks alright, but I mean, it's no Bloodborne. So their visuals ended up being very scaled back, very copy-paste, very repeatedly reused. The emphasis there was on mechanics, and as you can see from both games, there's a give and take.
What's more is that I found my inputs constantly getting eaten by difficult frame pacing. Bloodborne's FPS difficulties are compounded by frame pacing that spaces out stuttered frames to try and keep the visuals smooth, even when the frames are dropping to like 10 per second. But since Bloodborne tries to store inputs for the next move in a sequence after the current move animation is done, these inputs can just be eaten by the frame pacing. If you quickly tap heal during a fight in Nioh, your character will just heal, or die trying, as they're caught with their pants down during the animation. The game is extremely responsive and receptive to sudden button presses. Nioh listens and obeys. And the second my palette stretched out even slightly beyond what Bloodborne had to offer, I looked back on a game that had become stiff and frustrating. Animations felt like they dragged, things felt slow. Merely maneuvering my character around the battlefield just bothered me. Looking at the array of available weapons in Bloodborne, there's a good selection, but each one is identical. Sure, you can apply gems, which offers the opportunity for some slightly more complex builds, but nowhere near the extent that Nioh offers, and granted, you'd never need it to the same extent as Nioh either. Bloodborne is simply not as hard. I don't know about you, but in FromSoft games, Demon Souls had a New Game Plus cycle that felt like I was being peeled like a potato. That game's New Game Plus is fucking solid, it's insane. After that, each New Game's respective New Game Plus cycle began to feel very unbalanced. You can fly through every installment of the following game's New Game Plus in a fraction of the time, killing bosses in just a few hits. I'm pretty sure a fully leveled Zweihander will kill Northern Asylum Demon in like 2 hits on New Game Plus, maybe 3. Same for Bloodborne, your weapons max out during your first single playthrough. You get to plus 10, so New Game Plus has already reached a difficulty cap that you absolutely scream past. Sure, I imagine New Game Plus 8 is hard, but I don't want to play a game 8 times to find some challenge. The skill ceiling is low, and you're on a trampoline in the FromSoft series. Nioh's New Game Plus is an uphill battle that requires constant skill development, dedicated leveling to ensure proper scaling, and the careful assembly of weapons with desired attributes. Farming is never a grind, the game isn't about grind. You work to find what you need, it takes like an hour, and then you carry on until the weapons are obsolete, and then you repeat. This sounds like a drag, but it gives you an opportunity to switch your build each time you need a readjustment or want to try something new. You can't respec your skills in Bloodborne, which is a design decision that left me stunned, and probably contributed to the failing PvP scene, but you can respec in the Nioh games. All you have to do is buy the Book of Reincarnation, use it, and then remember to redistribute your liquidated experience instead of walking into a new mission, dying, and losing everything. Nioh has more endgame too. Literally 4 updates worth of scaled, properly designed New Game Plus that is released incrementally to give proper balancing changes and refreshed challenge, rather than just in New Game Plus enemies have more health, which I love and respect. Beyond that, there's the Underworld if you want real challenge. In Nioh, you can grind for the best weapons and then use them to have a tiny fighting chance in the hardest post-game. Double boss fights, 999 floors of monstrous challenge. If Elden Ring had been made by Team Ninja, I guarantee you'd have to fight the Fire Giant and Melania at once. And she would be red.
I don't want to see that woman again unless it's on Live Leak.
Compared to the Chalice dungeons, which offer gems to grind so that you can have gems to grind, even more to fight something, beyond incrementally scaling stats, there's no endgame in Bloodborne. The Chalice dungeons were cool, but imagine that experience more in line with Nioh's Underworld, a crushingly difficult challenge designed to be tackled with the very best gear that you can take friends along with. A proper endgame with tons of potential for the online community to keep that passionate player base thriving.
I actually tried very hard to dip my feet into Bloodborne PvP, but it is absolutely dead. I would go up against the same, like 2 or 3 people over and over again for hours, and not in a way that was fun, in a way that was like, none of us could respec or change our builds, so it just ended up being these desperately bland tournaments of just waiting for somebody else to hop on the server. Sure, there's no PvP in Nioh, but there's basically also no PvP in Bloodborne, it's just a matter of perspective. Nioh's challenge cripples its ability to provide graphically interesting levels and insights, keeping things clean, linear, and extremely clear, which, if you hate that, you can always turn to a FromSoft game. But man, if you want something different and far more difficult to dig your teeth into, you're gonna love Nioh.
If not for the FPS, I'd have gone back to Bloodborne with open arms and a bored throat. I'm still hoping for a PS5 port with a higher frame rate to accommodate that. There's a lot the Souls series does miles better than Nioh, and I've gone back to the Souls games many times. I still like them. This isn't me saying I don't like the Souls games, but if there's one game that soured badly upon my return, it was Bloodborne. Thanks a lot, Nioh. And thank you for watching. If you're still here and you're not watching purely out of hatred, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope my discussion felt reasonable even if you didn't agree with it. I love the Souls series, but I also love love the Nioh series. They're like my children, in the sense that I love them both, but obviously I have a favourite. If you enjoyed the video, please drop me a like and subscribe here on YouTube. What was your experience with Nioh and Bloodborne? If you could improve Bloodborne, what would you do? And vice versa for Nioh, what do you think is missing? Anyway, make sure to check out my Patreon and other social links in the description below, and have an amazing week, everybody. See you later.